Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Adrian. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Jana, and the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice for making possible this event. And thanks to you all for attending. I know at least for people here at our university, it's a very busy moment. So I appreciate your time and look forward to the conversation today. So it's with great pleasure that I'm here to introduce Verónica Gago, a thinker and activist whose work inspires so many of us to think through the relationship between labor struggles and women's struggles, capaciously understood. And I think it's felicitous, it is a coincidence, that we are now on April 27th, poised between International Women's Day in March and May Day, May 1st, because Gago's work urges us to situate the often forgotten connections between labor struggles and women's struggles within a longer history and within a broader map, a global map, as she articulates in her book, The Feminist International, Verso 2020. Gago is joining us today from New York, where she's teaching what she just told us about a fabulous graduate seminar, and she is Andres Bello Chair in Latin American Cultures and Civilizations at NYU for this semester. But her home base is Buenos Aires, Argentina, where she has produced influential works of scholarship and helped to shape one of the most formidable women's movements in recent history. A political scientist, Gago is the author of the book Neoliberalism from Below, Popular Pragmatics and Baroque Economies, which was first published in Argentina in 2014 and then by Duke in 2017. This is a fascinating study on the work of migrants, and particularly Bolivian migrant women, and how their work rearranges our understanding of political economy in the present. Grounded in an analysis of a large informal market in Buenos Aires called La Salada, and I think it is still one of the largest informal markets of its kind, Gago radiates outward from this site to consider how, from below, fraught categories such as proletarian, the working day, entrepreneur, breadwinner, and more are undergoing stark transformations in the present. Foregrounding the work of Bolivian theorists and scholars, Neoliberalism from Below also forms part of a broader project to have us read and reread global left feminisms, anti-racisms, and decolonial thought from the South. We see this in Gago's co-founding of the important publishing collective Tinta Limón, dedicated to circulating radical thought in South America, and which has made available writings by, among others, Angela Davis, Silvia Federici, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, Maurizio Lazzarato, Paulo Virno, Wendy Brown, Sally Polenicki, and Marielle Franco. Throughout, Gago is committed to exploring enduring patterns of injustice in the contemporary landscape, including the rise of new economic actors who are also newly politicized or politicized differently. For example, the daughters of the unemployed who join in protest on the blockade or piquete, trans women's struggle for labor rights, hemispheric calls to name and fight against femicide, and also an investment in desire as a political and economic category that remains a potent force for new figures of the collective, even as it is marshaled by neoliberal regimes for other means. Throughout her work as a writer, editor, organizer, and theorist, Gago thinks with voices and bodies as they occupy and shape spaces of collective organization. The assembly as feminist polyphony, the olla popular or communal kitchen in the street, the occupation of the plaza. Organization is a problem that is at once political, economic, and, I think, aesthetic, if by aesthetic we understand shared experiences of perception, of the sensorium, of the rhythm of bodies breathing together in protest, the sounds of the collective cry, or the loose, non-hierarchical choreographies of tens of thousands of people occupying public space in the women's strikes of recent years. In their multiracial, multi-generational, and multi-gendered struggles that keep the economic and public dimensions of what have too often been considered merely cultural, merely moral, or private issues at the forefront. Argentina, with its strong syndicalist tradition and high rates of unionization, also needs, Gago has forcefully argued, to rework its understanding of the strike, along with the rest of the world. Gago's work takes up those left outside of wage labor, while also pointing to how women activists are transforming unions from within. Rejecting singular authorship and proper names for the production of new forms of gestation and a new plural, a first-person plural or we, this collective project offers a trenchant rejoinder to those who, especially from the global north, insisted or until recently continued to insist on sounding the death knell for the strike, or for any category or tactic that points to how people might, in the words of Marx, put their heads together, or, thinking with Gago, put their heads and their bodies together to reimagine new possibilities in the face of tremendous exploitation. In the words of the Ni Una Menos movement, who we might be hearing more about today, taken up in the title of a recent anthology by Verso on global reproductive justice struggles, we organize to change everything. Verónica, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. Thank you very much, Sarah, for this so warm and generous presentation. Thank you, everyone in the center who is making possible this event. I'm very honored to be here with you today, and it's a pleasure for me to share some thoughts, some lines of research, and some hypotheses that we are developing also in our praxis, in our political praxis. So I want to speak about massiveness and transversality, trying to reimagine some kind of political articulation, their problems, their possibilities, but also trying to think in our political commitment and their power to conceptualize what we are doing. So I will start saying that in the last years, the feminist movement has taken to the streets to intervene and channel anti-neoliberal protest, popular and indigenous uprisings and strikes, as well as impregnated parliamentary candidacies and dispute constituent reforms. So it's a wide spaces of political intervention that I am interested on remark. March 8, the Feminist Strike Day, was re-established as a global day of demonstrations, recovering memories and genealogies, but above all, opening a common plane, a collective perception of a political movement. And I think this is a very interesting thing, how we can sustain this perception of a common political movement. March 8 launched a political process that is transnational and put the issue of violence and labor, and especially reproductive labor, in the center of the movement. Since then, since I think 2017, from different geographies, we have been nourishing a process that has become increasingly complex over time, a process that requires sustaining transversal coordination each time, and that marks a decisive event in the history of the recent cycle of mass feminism at different places. So the impact of violence as an everyday experience, from sexual violence to financial violence to labor exploitation to evictions, just to name a few, has a lot to do with the expansion of a feminist sensibility that names, denounces, and produces comprehension about its root causes. But this is primarily because this movement, this feminist movement, I think, allows for confronting violence and not only suffering from it. I think this kind of displacement is very strategic. Organizing to fight for better incomes, for housing, to overturn repressive legislation, against the precarization of lives, against institutional racism, are concrete forms of mapping this network of different forms of violence and defining tactics in territories where that violence is condensed and reinforced. So this diagnosis of violence generates a line of demarcation of self-defense, a radical question about practices of justice. However, what I am especially interested in thinking about are the political forms of the struggle that arise from identifying and disputing that violence and connecting these different ways of violence. Recognizing that diagnosis of the forms of violence allows feminist struggle to mobilize an understanding of patriarchal colonial extractivism, capitalism, starting from everyday life. I think this displacement between a sort of intersectional analysis, but rooted, embedded in everyday practices is our challenge. Uniting scales, weaving together different dimensions, in this way innovating in the articulation of minoritarian vectors with a becoming mass scale. I think that connection between the so-called minoritarian problematics, minoritarian vectors of politicization, and this mass scale, it is another challenge that I'm very interested in. This point seems fundamental for understanding how feminist struggles have achieved a transborder massiveness and multiple temporalities and spatialities, capable of intervening in the local, national, regional, and global conjuncture, and have also been able to become a component of other mobilizations, protests, and uprisings. This idea of different components of the feminist movement, but also how the feminist movement become a component of other uprisings and protests, I think is also very interesting. That massiveness, on the one hand, is not homogeneous. I want to underline that. At the same time, as it has allowed for escaping from fragmentation. So this sort of tension between massiveness as not homogeneous practice and avoid fragmentation, it is a tension that we are all the time disputing and debating. This is achieved by this massiveness is achieved by integrating a multiplicity of conflicts from practices and struggles that historically have been categorized as minoritarian, also marginal. With this, the opposition between minoritarian and majoritarian is displaced. The minoritarian takes on a mass scale as a vector of radicalization within a composition that does not stop expanding. But at the same time, feminism becomes a vector of radicality within broader movements. Today, for example, we can see in popular indigenous revolts in different countries in Latin America where the feminist protagonism is a presence that is unavoidable. So I think that is interesting to think about how the feminist movement become unavoidable for other struggles. The feminism of the South, if we can call it like that, in its multiple concrete expressions, have carried out a sustained exercise of transversal alliances that were able to expand in practice both the strength of the statements and the capacity for action. So this double bind between capacity for action and statements and the productivity of slogans, I think this intertwine. In fact, I think it can be argued that if we can see reactionary action somewhere, it is in the decomposition of those alliances. So this capacity for alliances implied having the skill to include conflicts that until recently were not considered part of feminism concerns. Reinventing feminism itself, but above all, transversalizing a mode of action and feminist problematization in all political spaces. For example, the affirmation of the strike as a process that accumulates force, programmatic demands, and a desire for a future, delineates a feminism that is constructed as popular and anti-neoliberal. I think those features are very important in our feminist movement, this popular feature and this popular linked to anti-neoliberal. This capacity for alliances imply having the skill to, I say, includes different conflicts and transversalizing this anti-neoliberal perspective. This shows that feminism do not propose isolated and specific agendas, but rather a politics of social transformation that directly enters into dispute with these reactionary times. So I think that this is also an important challenge, how we are not isolated in specific demands, in specific agenda, in a sort of language of the victims to be repaired. And we are able to connect different struggles to produce a systematic reading of our times and how we propose a radical transformation. So this encourages feminist initiatives to define themselves as anti-neoliberal, not only as a sort of ideological affirmation, but based on concrete practice of identifying the frontiers where the battle against capital's advance takes place. How the capital forms of exploitation are directed to concrete bodies and territories. That is, it shapes the confrontation against the privatization of pensions, against household debt, against cuts to public services, against wage cuts, etc. And how put all this in relation to the way in which violence against certain bodies marked by their gender and race is co-produced. This not only provides concrete content to the anti-neoliberalism of feminist initiative, but also challenges that there is no outside to the omnipresent neoliberal governmentality. I think that those feminist practices enable us to challenge totalizing readings of neoliberalism, as well as those analyses that understand neoliberalism in terms of the definitive defeat of subaltern subjectivities. I think we are also disputing the characterization of neoliberal violence and also the definition of neoliberal itself. So I would like to think here about this political praxis of connection between struggles, taking into account, for example, as Chandra Mohanty says, a grounded and particularized analysis. I would like to emphasize the way in which the feminist movement is weaving together different conflicts, expanding the limits of what we call feminism. In this sense, the connection of struggles and the practice of translation that this connection implies is a sort of theory of articulation, but challenging the more traditional approaches, I think. In Argentina, the first time we called strike in 2016 to respond to a femicide, the question asked by the media was, what does this femicide have to do with a strike? Of course, the expected answer was nothing. You are mixing everything up, say, for example, the mass media. And again, when in Argentina, we organized a demonstration in front of the central bank to denounce public and private debt and its relation with gender violence, they asked the same. Even today, when we organize an action with the tenant union, we have to explain what it means that the home is a laboratory for capital after the pandemic and why rent is a feminist issue. So this repetition as a way of failing to understand the media and different NGOs and different political actors are all the time arguing is a sign to be interpreted. I think that the statement about mixing everything up is the reactionary way of saying that the way of connection and translation we are nourishing is impossible. That each conflict has its own box, that each issue must be self-referential and respond to a single interpretation. And of course, there are clear borders that organize the grammar of problems and the subject of enunciation. So it is a sort of enclosure to analyze and to experience political conflicts that the social media, but also NGOs are proposing, and we are confronting that. But beyond the reactionary meaning, it is a sign that these mixtures of connections are not evident, are not obvious. They require political work to become meaningful and to be part of the collective comprehension of a concrete totality. By a concrete totality, I am referring to the multilateral and vital connection between everything and everything else. One of my arguments is that the power of feminism in these years can be read in a twofold way and in connected levels. On one hand, its capacity to build alliances in order to expand the definition of conflicts that are considered or become part of feminist concerns. Here, the political technology of the alliance is what effectively produces the relationship between conflicts. And conflicts precede alliances. Alliances arise as confrontation, but the definition of the conflict also depends on the alliance. The way you define and describe conflict is part of how this conflict is understood, depending on the actors that are involved. So it is not an idea and a political technology of the alliance as a consensus. I think that the alliances are stronger when they are nourished by conflict, and also in the way they can define this conflict as an alliance of different actors involved. So for building alliances, we need to share a conflict, and being part of a conflict means being aware of how this conflict affects us. This is not obvious because we have a lot of different devices and governmental rationalities that are all the time dividing us and individualizing us from the social and political conflicts. This is also what happened with the fight for free abortion in Argentina, also known as the Green Tide. The illegalization of abortion was connected with the different forms of violence against women and feminized bodies as systemic violence. The violence of often deadly and costly clandestine abortion was connected to domestic violence, sexual harassment, and the gender pay gap in the workplace, and to the murders of female environmental and indigenous activists in rural areas. In turn, this enables constructing the demand for abortion in terms that go beyond a merely individual right, challenging the conception of the body as private property. I also worked on how, in my book, Feminist International, how a concept like the body territory as a single word, as a single concept, an idea force that emerges from particular anti-extractivist struggles in Latin America, has the power to migrate, resonate with, and compose other territories and other struggles, including abortion. In the struggle for the legalization of abortion, the body in dispute thus exceeds the conquest of individual private rights. The massive mobilization demanding legal, safe, and free abortion overflows the request for legislative recognition at the same time that it calls for it, of course. This is due to the fact that it reveals the dispute over the sovereignty of a body territory that allows for the connection of anti-extractivist struggles with those for abortion. So again, here the question is how we connect these different struggles that appears in a first moment as completely diverse, as completely separated. How we build this connection and we produce a sort of political knowledge of those connections. On the other hand, this capacity to expand the scope of demands and concerns and to produce very heterogeneous alliances enables the feminist movement itself to become part of other struggles and protests. So I want to say that it's a sort of twofold becoming of the transformation of feminism itself and in terms of composition with other movements. One is the condition of possibility of the other. This twofold becoming is not just adding forces, but entering into composition and also undoing patriarchal inertia within social movements. So I use the term transversality to think about this concrete political method. The feminist strike marked, I think, at the global level, a qualitative leap in the scale and massiveness of feminism. That is the capacity to generate mobilizations with an enormous force that are capable of occupying streets, plazas, cities, simultaneously in different places of the world, and to sustain this political process since 7 years. I have been conceptualizing the feminist strike as a process of political transversality sustained by the work of building alliances. The alliances are a truly political tool. I underline truly because alliances tend to be banalized, like if it was a sort of magic formula or a spontaneous form of consensus. Alliances do not follow a logic of consensus, but of strategy. And I think this is a central point of this idea of articulation. They are built with a common objective. In that sense, they are experiments tied to political conjunctures. They operate with that temporality. However, experimenting with an alliance, testing out its efficacy, vividly feeling the expansion of possibilities it makes possible, makes alliances a desirable resource. In other words, often they are achieved because there is a memory of what they allow, and that is the first step for their materialization. So I think that when we experience the force and the strength and the political capacity of that sort of alliances, we achieve also a memory for the next times, and also we connect with other memories of political commitment. Political alliances are organized according to a shared program by cultivating a proximity between different struggles through an agreed upon evaluation about what must be prioritized. Therefore, they are a political technology to determine, one, what is urgent, so a question of temporality and conjuncture. Second, what are the plans for intervention, what is to be done? And third, what road map to give to the conflict. So that involves the definition of the conflict, but also a road map to build together. Alliances are what enable scaling up conflicts. So it is a question of scale, projecting the conflicts, making them jump scales, making them audible for the many to achieve a victory. Alliances invent a composition that does not leave out interest. And I think in that sense, they mobilize a pragmatic intelligence. But they are also build a common plane capable of including other possible meanings of belonging, commitment, and affectation. So the alliance, I think it is also putting the question of what kind of structure we are producing in each conjuncture, and how the temporality and the duration of that alliances means a sort of structure for the struggles. The alliances that jump over narrow fences are the first thing that are at risk through forms of funding that segment us, through dynamic of setting a specific agenda, as I was saying before, through electoral calculations, and etc. Alliances are concrete ways of thinking beyond the individual, or rather, of assuming the dependency of individuals with their alliances, as Judith Butler argues. An alliance with the landscape, for example, provokes an anti-extractivist perspective. An alliance among neighbors makes it possible to think about definancializing housing. An alliance between students and women workers in the popular economy allows for creating a community school. An alliance gathered together in a trans non-binary assembly enables freeing a lesbian who had been incarcerated for defending herself. An alliance allows public hospital directors and autonomous abortion providers to make a law effective. So I am thinking in that kind of alliances, in terms of concrete situations where without this sort of political intelligence of alliances, we cannot act together. Within transfeminist alliances implies a political action of producing proximity with a conflict from the perspective of different subjects and collectives. What are the instances where those alliances are coming into being? How can alliances of this kind develop? The answer is hard work, politically speaking. A lot of time is devoted to organizing meetings, assemblies, initiatives, working hard together to produce an expanded definition of a conflict, writing together a manifesto or a call. And I think that the dispute over time, over our capacity to have time for political action is one of the central conflicts today, because precarization and not only individualization is against this capacity of time to do politics. So these alliances, those type of initiatives reveal also the character of interdependence in a very concrete way. The alliances do not flourish, they should be sought. What do we need to think about and practice the art of political alliances? Or what are the elements that I am thinking of when I try to think in political articulation, taking into account massiveness and transversality? I will list a couple of problems, elements, and also dilemmas that I think we are confronted in order to sustain these political alliances as a form of political articulation. The third question is, or the third problem, I think, is time. I was talking about time. March 8, as well as other initiatives and dates that we are all the time producing as movement, has become a movement of collective programmatic elaboration, making demands explicit, evaluating the conjuncture, accumulating information about what is happening, and articulating plans made up of microscopic knowledges. Details, for example, about what happens in a police station or in a social assistance program, or when supermarket cashiers try to organize without a union, and how we connect these different micro scenes and micro knowledge of political conflicts with analysis of the whole. It is also a moment of mixing registers and spheres that does not occur at any time. So these dates are the moment, or they build a momentum for these connections in assemblies, in meetings, and in different common spaces. It is also a moment of the production of the strike. The feminist strike, for example, produces a time for focusing our collective attention on what we are doing, where we want to go, what we have achieved and what we have not, and what are our problems nowadays. Through this listening, collective efforts are dedicated to going over and producing a clear understanding of what the movement is proposing. So I think that we need a lot of time to sustain these different moments of collective assembly, of collective knowledge, and to nourish this collective elaboration of political problems. Certainly, one of the traditional questions of political theory is how to make the spaces of political action that erupt out of certain events last over time or become more permanent. Alliances are also a specific technology for producing temporality, for constructing duration. A movement's duration can be measured by its capacity to expand alliances. It is not a coincidence that as the movement grows, so do the premeditated attempts to divide the movement that occur at the same time in different countries, in different places. For example, through anti-sex worker or anti-trans people lines. I think that our movements are in terms of counter movements against us, and they try to divide and to destroy all these very difficult political work of alliances. So the second problem that I want to share is how we produce this transversality in the composition of the movement. This political transversality is nourished by the diverse territories of conflict. And I think the common question is how to build a common effect concerning problems that tend to be experienced as individual, as well as a political diagnosis of the different forms of violence that tend to be encapsulated as domestic or private violence. The transnational capacity forged by a common understanding of what sexist violence means in articulation with labor, financial, and institutional violence, among others, is achieved in conjunction with slogans, for example, about precarity. In this way, there is a dynamic of connection between a class condition that is not restricted to national borders, nor folded onto groups already recognized as workers. In recent years, the feminist movement has built a new type of internationalism that overturns scales, scopes, and forms of coordination of a movement that expands without ceasing to be situated, embedded. An internationalism that projects the current feminist movement onto the masses, positing the attack against the social reproduction of certain bodies and territories as a fundamental key. An internationalism that becomes transnationalism because it is made up of alliances that do not adhere to the border of nation state geometry, but also because they are dissidents in respect to the frames of an abstract notion of class, in which it is supposed that there are shared objective interests, or the abstract notion of people, in which it's supposed that there is an homogeneous amalgam of national affection. The third problem that I want to share is how to produce these initiatives around conflicts and how they are concrete materials of those alliances. If we define neoliberalism as a way of intensified extractivism, we can see how the feminist struggles are strategies against dispossession and against financial devices as a private solution to those dispossessions, and also a confrontation against new forms of value extraction. Therefore, I think there is an urgent need to expand initiatives with a certain orientation, one that confront the capacity to extract rents and that incorporate the conditions of labor's reproduction, from healthcare to housing to pensions and electricity and internet service as a public service, for example, into the labor struggle. It is the conception of labor that is at stake here, of who produces value and what modes of life deserve to be assisted, cared, and paid for, and also where the resources will come from if we aim for a global reorganization of the world of labor, but also to support the networks that produce what I call the domestication of care, where are other extended territories of care that are not just household. I think that there is a feminist pedagogy to do that and consists in proposing analysis while also developing programmatic interventions. The other point that I want to add is the importance of the slogans as a common intelligence. I think that the slogans are a very important thing for the internationalism of our movement. Internationalism enables a movement that is both unitary and plural, capable of finding for movement common vectors of meaning and bringing together the movement's actions, and at the same time understanding that this terrain of which we fight consists of the multiplication of dissimilar situations, of diverse landings. In any case, the slogans that make movement is a decisive point. Slogans have spatial and temporal validity, but their force lies precisely in connecting bodies and statements. When we read slogans that make sense across borders, for example, nos queremos vivas, ni una menos, el violador eres tú, el ENAO, it's not love, it's unpaid work, for example, they bring together theses that organize a way of understanding what happens and even orienting it. This has happened with different slogans that produce a political vocabulary. They are part of a popularization of a feminist grammatic. or grammar, sorry. In all of them, we find a set of unique elements that express very specific conjunctures that at the same time are able to be almost immediately translated into others. I'm very interested in this double sense of the slogans, the very concrete and embedded reading of a conjuncture, and at the same time, their capacity to express and resonate with very different problematics in other places. So they express sensitive transformation that are translated into a way of experiencing violence, self-defense, insecurity, collective force, the dispute over everything that makes up the perseverance of living in increasingly urgent and precarious context. These slogans imply transformation in bodies. They materialize threshold. In links, they propose a collective horizon, I think. And they do not lose the relationship with that common plane of the reproduction of everyday life. So I like also this to think about this connection in a meaningful repercussion of that slogan in everyday life, and at the same time, their capacity to produce a transnational dimension. In comparison to other social movements, I argue that the feminist movement is not anti-intellectual. There is precisely a desire for theory, a conception of theory as a way of understanding structural violence, as a tool for developing concepts to make sense of exploitation and also to argue against punitivism. There is much more promiscuous use of concepts, I think, in the feminist movement, but a very useful reappropriation of concepts and theories. One intelligent form of synthesis is found in the slogans as a synthesis of collective intelligence, but also in the textual proliferation and intervention on a fundamental plane, education, epistemology. And the concept is also disputed in media, schools, universities, and many instances of self-education and popular pedagogies. It is not a coincidence that the Chilean performance collective is called Las Tesis, the thesis. I think that this point, a theoretical vocation that is not disconnected from mass actions on the streets, is also crucial for understanding the violence unleashed against what has been termed as gender ideology. This conceptual dispute, this dispute about formation in schools, universities, but also this change in sensibilities, which is expressed also in our vocabularies to narrate. My last point, and I think I am okay with the time if it is the last point, is to think about a concept that we are working together with different comrades and collectives, that is a feminist unionism. I think that the conjunction of realities of social reproduction, of popular economies, as a way of organizing the reproduction of the majorities outside the forms of waged integration and the conditions of precarity, creates new zones of convergence between the dynamics of precarious labor and the work of social reproduction. At least in our countries, this convergence between feminist initiatives, popular economies, and the dispute in the social reproduction terrain for public resources, for example, is a very important terrain of struggle. I think that this is connected, for example, to what Maria Mies theorized as realities of super exploitation, when capital not only appropriates surplus time and labor in respect to necessary labor, but also advances over the appropriation of the time and labor necessary for the production of subsistence. Threading together the forms of exploitation of women, nature, and the colonies in a simultaneous sequence, as Maria Mies did, articulates the intersections of gender, race, imperialism, and class on which the systemic reproduction of capital depends. It posits other interpretative keys for thinking about the dynamics of proletarianization, not recognized as such. But above all, it reveals the strictly political character of its visibilization and valorization, as well as its decline in organizational dynamics. In this way, I think that popular feminism, especially in Argentina, disputing remuneration and the gender mandates of social reproduction became mutually implicated with popular economies, with the demands against precarization of labor that render visible the condition of unpaid work beyond the household. So this connection of different spatiality of non-recognized labor and wage labor is part of these political alliances in terms of new forms of unionism that are very infused by the feminist practice. One can be read in light of the other, and at the same time, they put each other in tension. The conjunction of feminism with dynamics of popular economy pushes toward a popular feminism and feminist dynamic related to the precarization and informalization of labor. And they produce this conjunction as an open struggle against the reactionary forms in which the end of the patriarchy of the wage, as Silvia Federici called it, seems to be dealt with, including within subaltern spaces. This concretely expands the contents of social reproduction, situating conflicts around housing, the neighborhood, and the land as key, although not the only, axis of struggle. In this way, it replenishes the politicity and capacity of leadership that emerges from reproductive economies. I think this is the other point that is very interesting, how the feminist movement is producing a new kind of leadership from the social reproduction struggles. And I think that this is also a challenge for other social movements that are obliged to recognize and to valorize these social reproduction struggles in a new way. So that produces a feminist unionism that exceeds the unions. It is a way of organizing demands and claims that takes seriously how feminism has broadened the concept of work and focuses on social reproduction. Feminist diagnosis of the pauperization of the conditions of waged, domestic, migrant working conditions and their accelerated processes of precarization were even more true in the pandemic, as we know, both because they expand of the notion of labor and because they propose union strategies for intervening in that expansion. For example, in Argentina was very important the campaign, the political and feminist campaign, reclaiming wages for communitarian labor. And I think that this mix between feminist unionism struggles within the terrain of social reproduction and these political alliances around the feminist strike are a very important component of the current conjuncture. So just to finish, we don't limit the agenda of unpaid work or care work. but we also talk about the unionism carried out by, for example, peasant women calling for agroecological modes of production, and the way in which tenants fight against real estate capital's destruction of rent. We are connecting those different territories: urban territories, tenant union struggle, and peasant struggle against agribusiness. The concept of feminist unionism perhaps does more justice to the way in which modes of organization have been transformed, and the transversality and connection between struggles produced by feminist organization around the international feminist strikes. The question is how to keep building a unionism that overthrows the framework of the demand of wage workers to take the agility of the feminist struggle on the terrains of social reproduction, housing, healthcare, education, neighborhood security, and so on. It is a matter of creating alliances with workers in each sector, but also of building an agenda that goes further, because it includes neighborhood residents, user renters, precarious workers. It is a question horizon, I call it, that emerges because when we go on strike, when we prepare a strike in assembly, we also produce the time for political innovation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Verónica Gago. I hope please join me in giving Verónica a round of applause. That was really very rich and should
Thank
provide a really wonderful foundation for great Q&A and discussion. So the floor will be open to questions. You can ask questions in one of two ways. One, you can ask the question yourself by navigating to the bottom of your screen and clicking on the reactions button, which will allow you to raise your hand electronically. I will call on your name, ask you to unmute, and then you can ask your question directly. If you choose to do that option, we would ask that you turn on your camera. Or if you are feeling a little bit shy today, you are also welcome to type your question into the chat, and I will read that question for you. So the floor is open.
I was wondering when you were talking about, the use of alliance and, so many words are coming to my mind, and you also use the word articulation. I'm grappling with Stuart Hall right now. So I'm also trying to really understand that term articulation and how to use it and how to understand it more precisely before using it. So I'm thinking, could you give a kind of difference between articulation and between articulation and intersection as you understand it? Because it seems to be like sometimes they're like two different things that I can't really get the difference between. And that's one. And the second part of my question, if I'm not taking too much space, is what are like the major I guess challenges in creating this, like bringing this so many things together, having this broad argument that all of these things are like interconnected, and that this feminist stance, kind of brings in so many other so many other concerns, even for like, people with non-cis, people with non-cis who identify with non-cis, gender and that kind of stuff. Like, what are those challenges? What are those practical challenges that you face as an intellectual, and also maybe as a movement, as an advocate? Because this idea of like you're bringing too many things together. What are those challenges that Because I'm also interested in making some of these arguments sometimes, and there's this way in which you already self-criticize yourself that you're just mixing things together and you're just splitting hairs here. Thank you. I hope I made sense.
Thank you, Babatunde. Veronica, before I ask you to respond, I would like to share one more question from the chat, so you can have two questions to mull over. This one comes from Mayra Oliva Rios, who writes, "Thank you. Where do indigenous struggles fit in these the feminist unionism that you propose, can you expand on indigenous feminist contributions? And then I'll ask one more, and this one comes from a guest in the chat whose name I don't want to butcher with the last name or potentially the first name Yao. My apologies. Thanks for the lecture, they write. So is it a kind of narrating for feminism to be constructed in different issues, such as anti-neoliberalism, so that its influence will be expanded?
Thank you very much for your questions. Are really important, I think. About this difference and maybe yes, the difference between articulation and intersectionality. I think it's important because I am trying to develop a theory of articulation of struggles, trying to analyze the political spaces where that articulation are produced. I think that intersectionality, it is at least a very important framework to analyze these connections between oppressions, exploitations, but I think that we need a more complex framework to analyze also the political praxis. So I am trying to add a political reading of the alliances, not only as a way of analysis of different oppressions and forms of exploitation. I am trying to go beyond the idea of analysis and trying to think how this political articulation is possible, taking into account the intersectional analysis, of course, that is very important and very useful. But I think that I want to highlight the political difficulties that we have to go from the analysis and diagnosis to the political praxis. And I think it is a tension, and it's also a question of picking up certain vocabularies and certain concepts when you want to emphasize something. Of course, maybe could be other uses of intersectionality that are very aware of this political articulation, but I try to think in more in terms more close to political dilemmas of articulation, and trying to say, well, if we have an intersectional analysis, it's not enough to produce a political articulation. So I am trying to dealing with that problem. And about the second question of, well, the challenges of bringing so many things together, I think it's a very important question, because it is at stake the pedagogies that we are developing as intellectuals, as researchers, and also as activists. So I think that is a constant exercise to produce those pedagogies in order to put all these things together and produce sense. Because we can put things together and say, oh, well, it's all over there, but we do not produce a political impact with those different strands of thinking, of conceptualization. So I think that the question of political pedagogies to connect those different analyses in intersectional terms that we were talking before, and to produce sense for a political praxis is a very crucial question for me. And about the indigenous struggle that somebody was asking, I think they are crucial, and at least in Argentina, but I think not only in Argentina, the question of land is what the feminist movement learned from indigenous struggles. And a lot of different indigenous people and leadership and collectives are working together with different feminist initiatives against neo-structuralism. And also, I think that is what is interesting is how the feminist struggle includes some indigenous issues and problematic as a central agenda. So I think that this is interesting, that it is also a problem of political articulation that is not obvious, it's not clear how to do it always, but I think that there is a lot of conceptual production from indigenous feminist and indigenous collectives and people that are nourishing this expanded comprehension of conflicts that we were talking about. So I think that their production is at the center of the stage. And also it is crucial for this expanded comprehension of capitalism nowadays that targets the land and the resources as main object. I don't know if I understood the last question, but I think that anti-neoliberalism is also a very important term, not only as a sort of umbrella term. I am more interested in how the concrete struggles produce anti-neoliberalism, not as a sort of tag that you have before you started to struggle. Rather, how we can define anti-neoliberalism as an effect of different struggles. And I think that that difference is interesting, because you can say we are all anti-neoliberal, but could be a very wide sentence and a very void slogan. And I think that it's more interesting to think what kind of struggles are producing concrete anti-neoliberalism, in which sense different struggles are confronting capital in very concrete spaces, for example, housing, for example, land, for example, pensions, for example, public services, and how we build an idea of anti-neoliberalism from below, from the practices that are nowadays struggling in very concrete spaces.
Thank you so much for that. So first I'll go to Boyd, who has posted a question in the chat, and then I will turn to two of our guests who I will ask their questions directly. Boyd writes, could you briefly clarify your concept of the transversal process and then comment on difficulties or possibilities for groups with significant aspects of intersectional dominance, for example, white left males, to become capable of constructive transversal participation? And then I will next go to Helen, followed by Erica. So Helen, if you wouldn't mind turning on your camera to ask your question to Verónica.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me, you can see me. It's not really a question, it's just more how what you said, Verónica, and how it really resonates with something that's happening here in the United Kingdom. I'm over here in the United Kingdom. So at the moment, a particular workforce is actually striking and their unions are not having it. And this particular workforce, which sort of hits home for me, are nurses. And nurses are 85% female in the UK. at least in the UK anyway. And actually a lot of women of color or women from the global south, from lower to middle income countries, actually come to the UK to practice nursing. And they are currently striking to ask for better working conditions and pay. And I think when you mentioned like unionism and the intersectionality of race, class, and gender, I feel like what's happening right now is a perfect example to demonstrate that I guess what you're saying is really happening in real life, and that the government, which the UK government is a bit pants at the moment. That's not news, but it's mostly controlled by men, white men, and you can really see how a large profession such as nursing in the UK is just being demonized left, right, and center. And I can't help but think that the fact that is 85% women, and also women from like all sorts of backgrounds, but primarily working class women, and also women from the global south and from lower to middle income countries that come here to practice nursing. I feel like all the intersections sort of get together, and what you said just really resonated with me. And I really wish that, I guess a layman or people out there reading the news wouldn't just be so, I guess, read the surface layer of the information and then sort of attach themselves to like a hyperbolic argument. And like, it's either be this or that. But for me, I see as really, all these core characteristics of this group of people are interwoven. You cannot like dissect it away, and we all have to like come together and definitely unite together and shout from the rooftops that there is value in the work that nurses do, and it's don't devalue that. And that's all really. I don't know if I'm saying anything pertinent. I'm just sort of rambling, but I just want to say that what you said is so pertinent right now. And I'm just really glad that there are people like yourself pushing this academic narrative out there, as with other people as well. And because I feel like with a lot of discussions about feminism, at least here in the United Kingdom, it's still like stuck in the second wave, not very progressive. And the rhetoric is, I should be so grateful you have a job as a woman, but not like, oh, hi, I'm still earning, a percentage less than a man on every pound that I do. And obviously as a woman of color, I earn even less. And, microaggressions at work and lack of progression in the job place, and really not seeing myself, people like me as an East Asian woman or AAPI in the US, being represented in the high echelons of management and in the workplace. So all this is like so important. And what you said really resonates right now.
Thank you so much for that, Helen. And finally, we'll go to Erica. Erica, I'm going to ask you to unmute. And if you can turn on your camera, please do so to ask your question.
So your biggest kind of advocacy here is for alliances between groups that maybe wouldn't see kind of connections between each other. But I think that especially in the United States, we've seen a lot of groups that do have very connected and like kind of obvious alliances kind of fragmenting themselves away from the larger groups. So I'm kind of thinking like Black women moving away from the broader feminist movement, immigrants from the broader labor movement, transgender people and Black queer people from the LGBTQ movement, mostly because they feel like their struggles are not specifically addressed by the broader movement. And that, you're kind of advocating for, you don't have to have the same struggles, but you have to have like kind of the same, motion forward. But I feel like these people don't feel like they kind of fit in with this larger group. So you kind of like already addressed the advantages of alliances and like how they come about, but how would you address groups that maybe feel like they're better off being separated from a larger movement? And how would you recommend that both sides, like the fragmented groups and the larger groups, kind of come together in a more allied way?
Thank you very much. Are very important issues that you are sharing. First, the idea of transversality, I want to emphasize that it's not a sort of non-problematic form of alliance. I think that I prefer also this notion of transversality to go beyond more traditional notions of articulation, where you have very consistent groups that decide to produce something together. I try to think in a more dynamic and more problematic idea of articulation when I am thinking in transversality. It is not that you have these very self-aware groups of their interests that decide as a consensus to participate in a political articulation. But I think that the core of this idea of transversality is how a conflict organizes the dimension of articulation, and not an abstract or not so abstract, but an idea of interest of different groups that decide by consensus to be together. So I am trying to think around other constellation of terms as transversality, to think how these alliances are being possible in the last years. But of course, the problems are all the time. And part of the transversality is how to manage these kind of problematics. And I link here with the last question of Erika about fragmentation and that idea of maybe different groups perceive themselves powerful without being part of a wider movement. And I think there is a problem because I am trying to analyze how this mass scale of movement is important. At the same time, it's not homogeneous and it's not a constant mood of the movement. But I'm trying to think how this mass scale is completely unavoidable if you want to change in terms of radicality certain things. So I think that this tension between massiveness produced as a non-homogeneous notion of the masses, and transversality as a political technology to build together without the idea of consensus and without the idea of very well and restricted, defined groups that are deciding if they are part or not of this wider movement. I am trying to think in different forms where this massiveness is a sort of collective energy that then it is translated as specific force for each group. So I am not saying that you have to be in a massive movement to be or to have strength, but I think that is a different nature of strength if you are part of a massive movement, and then you use this massive strength for your particular struggle. So I am trying to displace this idea of how you recognize your own force, how you address your own agenda, and which is the relationship with a more wider movement. And I think that we have the experience that the massive movement is what has the capacity to change things. So I am trying to think how this massiveness is produced one and again, and how we can structure a sort of duration of this massiveness without being a sort of traditional movement of political parties, unions, and other sort of things. And what Helen was saying, I think is crucial, because we can see today in the conflicts the very explicit intersectionality of different operations and forms of exploitation. And I am very interested in to problematize why, if we are seeing so clear the intersectionality that appears in those conflicts, why is so difficult to organize as in terms of transversality. So this sort of gap between the explicit intersectionality of the conflicts and the impossibility of a transversality in terms of political articulation. I am trying to think, what is this kind of gap that, as Ellen was talking about, we can see in, for example, the nurses' struggle and the nurses' strike. Also, I read about it here in the United States of the victory in nurses' strike. We can see very, very explicitly this intersectionality of the struggle, and it is more and more difficult to build alliances taking into account this intersectionality. So what is the gap between this form of explicitation and the political articulation in terms of transversality? I think this is a challenge for us, and this is why I'm so interested in think again the idea of massiveness, but from the point of view of the alliances.
Well, I'm afraid that is all of the time we have for today. As usual, we run out of this precious thing called time when we could use much more of it to continue the discussion. So on behalf of the Havens Wright Center for Social Justice, the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program here at UW-Madison, I would really like to thank Verónica Gago for joining us today, for Sarah Wells, her introduction, and to you, our audience. We look forward to seeing you again soon, but it won't be until the fall. So until then, be well and take good care. Thank you so much for coming. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.